Hi, I'm Juliet, and 3 weeks ago, I inherited my grandfather's farm in Millbrook Valley, thinking I'd finally found my escape from the corporate world. But as I walked through those eerily quiet pastures on my first morning, watching dozens of cattle, horses, and chickens move their mouths without making a single sound, I realized I hadn't inherited a sanctuary. I had inherited a secret that would change everything I thought I knew about my family, my grandfather, and the very nature of silence itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, delivered to my cramped studio apartment by a courier who looked like he'd driven straight from the countryside. I was rushing to get ready for another soul-crushing day at Meridian Marketing, where I spent my days crafting campaigns for products I didn't believe in, when the knock at my door stopped me cold. "Miss Juliet Chen," the elderly man said, consulting a clipboard with hands that shook slightly. "I have a delivery that requires your signature. Legal documents from the law offices of Patterson and Associates in Millbrook Valley." The name hit me like a physical blow. Millbrook Valley. I hadn't heard those words spoken aloud in 15 years. Not since the last time I'd visited Grandfather Henry's farm as a college student. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and sealed with the kind of formal wax stamp that suggested old money and older secrets. My hands trembled as I broke the seal, the weight of the papers inside somehow heavier than they should have been. The letterhead was elegant, professional, but the words beneath it shattered my morning routine and possibly my entire life. "Dear Miss Chen," I read, my coffee growing cold on the counter, "we regret to inform you of the passing of your grandfather Henry Chen on September 15th. As per the terms of his last will and testament, you have been named the sole beneficiary of his estate, including the property known as Whispering Pines Farm, comprising 847 acres in Millbrook Valley, along with all livestock, buildings, and associated assets." I sank into my kitchen chair, the letter fluttering to the table as my vision blurred with unexpected tears. Grandfather Henry. The man who had taught me to ride horses, who had let me help him feed chickens when I was barely tall enough to reach their coops, who had told me stories about the land that stretched back generations. He was gone, and somehow, impossibly, he had left me everything. The legal language continued, outlining meetings with attorneys, property transfers, and a dozen other complications I couldn't process through the fog of grief and shock. But one line stood out, written in different handwriting, clearly added as a personal note from my grandfather himself. "Juliet," the note read in his familiar, careful script, "the farm has been waiting for you. There are things you need to understand, things I couldn't tell you while you were young. The animals will show you the way, but you must listen with more than your ears. Trust no one in Millbrook Valley until you know the truth. The silence protects us all." I read those words 3 times, my confusion growing with each pass. The animals will show you the way. Trust no one until you know the truth. The silence protects us all. What truth? What silence? And why was my grandfather, a man who had always been direct and practical, suddenly speaking in riddles? My phone buzzed against the table, jarring me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed my supervisor at Meridian Marketing, no doubt wondering where I was for the morning staff meeting. I stared at the screen, then at the legal documents spread before me, and made a decision that surprised even me. I declined the call and immediately dialed the law office in Millbrook Valley. Mr. Patterson, the attorney, had a voice like aged whiskey, warm but with an underlying strength that suggested he'd seen decades of rural legal battles. He confirmed what the letter had outlined but seemed reluctant to discuss details over the phone. "Miss Chen," he said carefully, "your grandfather was very specific about how this transition should occur. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He wanted you to come to the farm first, to experience it yourself before we discuss the more complicated aspects of your inheritance. There are certain conditions, certain responsibilities that come with Whispering Pines Farm that require explanation in person." "Conditions?" I pressed. "What kind of conditions?" The pause on the other end of the line stretched longer than was comfortable. Let's just say your grandfather was a man who understood the importance of protecting what matters most. When can you come to Millbrook Valley? Within an hour, I had called in sick to work, thrown clothes into a suitcase, and loaded my Honda Civic with supplies for what I assumed would be a week-long trip to settle affairs and put the farm on the market. The 5-hour drive from Chicago to Millbrook Valley gave me time to process the shock and to remember the summers I had spent on Grandfather Henry's farm as a child. I remembered the way morning mist clung to the pastures, the sound of roosters crowing at dawn, the gentle lowing of cattle as they grazed in fields that seemed to stretch forever. I remembered the way my grandfather moved through his daily routines with quiet confidence, speaking to his animals like old friends, maintaining equipment with hands that knew every bolt and wire on the property. Most of all, I remembered feeling safe there, surrounded by the constant symphony of farm life. The horses nickering in their stalls, the pigs snuffling and grunting in their pens, the chickens clucking and squawking as they pecked at the ground. It was a living, breathing world of sound and movement that had seemed magical to my young urban mind. The sun was setting as I finally turned onto the familiar dirt road that led to Whispering Pines Farm. The entrance was marked by a weathered wooden sign that had been there for as long as I could remember, though the paint was more faded now, the wood more silvered with age. As I drove up the winding driveway, flanked by the towering pine trees that gave the farm its name, I felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and apprehension. The farmhouse came into view first, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and dormers that suggested it had been built with care and meant to last. It looked exactly as I remembered it, down to the swing that still hung from the old oak tree beside the front steps. But something felt different, though I couldn't immediately identify what. I parked beside the house and stepped out, breathing deeply of air that was cleaner and cooler than anything Chicago had to offer. The scent of pine and hay and something else, something organic and earthy that spoke of generations of careful farming, filled my lungs. This was home in a way my apartment had never been, despite the 15 years I'd spent away. As I grabbed my suitcase from the trunk, I became aware of a strange sensation. Quiet. Not just the absence of city noise, but a deeper quiet than I remembered from childhood visits. Farm sounds had always been part of the landscape here, but now there was nothing. No lowing cattle, no neighing horses, no clucking chickens. Just the whisper of wind through the pine trees and the distant sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was simply the time of day, that animals were naturally quieter in the evening. But as I walked toward the house, key in hand from the packet Mr. Patterson had mailed, I caught sight of the pastures in the fading light. They weren't empty. Dark shapes moved in the fields, the familiar silhouettes of cattle and horses. They were there, they were active, but they made no sound. The key turned easily in the front door, as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, the house smelled of lemon oil and cedar, suggesting someone had been maintaining it even after Grandfather Henry's death. The furniture was draped with white sheets, but I could see the familiar shapes of the armchairs where he used to read his farming magazines, the kitchen table where we'd shared countless meals during my childhood summers. I set my suitcase down and walked through the quiet rooms, each one triggering memories I hadn't accessed in years. The kitchen with its ancient but immaculate gas stove. The living room with its stone fireplace and shelves lined with books on agriculture and animal husbandry. The sun porch where my grandfather used to sit in the mornings, coffee in hand, watching his land wake up. It was in his study that I found the first clue that something was truly different about this inheritance. The room was exactly as I remembered it, dominated by a massive oak desk and walls lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves. But on the desk, clearly placed there recently, was a manila folder marked with my name in my grandfather's handwriting. Inside were documents I didn't understand at first glance. Scientific reports, veterinary records, correspondence with government agencies I'd never heard of. The letterhead on many of the documents bore the seal of the Department of Agriculture, but also others: Environmental Protection Agency, Centers for Disease Control, and something called the Rural Research Initiative. One document caught my attention immediately, a letter dated just 6 months before my grandfather's death. The return address showed it was from Dr. Sarah Williams, a veterinarian I vaguely remembered from childhood visits. The content, however, was unlike any veterinary correspondence I could imagine. Henry, the letter began. I know how difficult this decision has been for you, but the time has come to bring Juliet into the circle of knowledge. The situation at Whispering Pines Farm has stabilized, but it requires someone younger, someone with the education and energy to maintain what you've built. The animals trust her, they always have. That trust will be essential in the months ahead. The testing continues to show positive results. Whatever you discovered in that old mine shaft 20 years ago, whatever change it triggered in the animals, it's proven to be more beneficial than anyone could have predicted. The silence isn't just protecting them from outside interference anymore, Henry. It's protecting something much larger than any of us understood when this began. I read the letter 3 times, my confusion deepening with each pass. Mine shaft? Beneficial change? The silence protecting something larger? I shuffled through the other documents, finding references to the affected population, auditory modifications, and environmental containment protocols. It read like science fiction, not the straightforward farming records I had expected to find. My phone had no signal in the house, something I remembered from childhood but found more frustrating now. I needed answers, needed to call Dr. Williams or Mr. Patterson or anyone who could explain what these documents meant. But first, I needed to see the animals for myself, needed to understand what my grandfather meant when he said they would show me the way. I found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer, where it had always been kept, and stepped out into the night. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to navigate the familiar paths to the barn complex. As I walked, I became increasingly aware of the unnatural quiet surrounding me. Not just quiet, but absence of sound in a way that felt almost oppressive. The main barn was exactly as I remembered it, a massive structure that had housed generations of horses, cattle, and farm equipment. But as I approached the open doors, I could see movement inside that didn't match the silence. Horses shifted in their stalls, cattle moved restlessly in their pens, but none of them made any sound. I stepped inside and turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across stalls I remembered cleaning as a child. The animals were all there, healthy-looking and alert, but something was profoundly wrong. A mare I didn't recognize stepped forward to the front of her stall, and I could see her mouth opening and closing as if she were nickering a greeting. But no sound emerged, not even the whisper of breath. Moving deeper into the barn, I found the cattle section where my grandfather had kept his prize Holstein dairy cows. They turned toward my light, some of them opening their mouths in what should have been welcoming moos, but the silence was complete. Even their hoofsteps on the straw-covered floor were muted, as if the very air around them absorbed sound before it could travel. I reached out tentatively to touch the nose of a cow I remembered from childhood, a gentle old girl with distinctive white markings around her eyes. She accepted my touch calmly, but when she tried to respond vocally, her throat moved without producing even the faintest whisper of sound. The chickens were equally disturbing. The coop that had once been filled with constant clucking, squawking, and the rustle of feathers now contained birds that moved through their routines in perfect silence. I could see roosters throwing back their heads in the classic crowing position, their beaks opening wide, but no sound emerged. As I stood in that silent barnyard, surrounded by dozens of animals that should have been creating a symphony of farm sounds, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. This wasn't natural. This wasn't normal. And according to the documents in my grandfather's study, it wasn't accidental. I made my way back to the house, my mind racing with questions and possibilities I wasn't prepared to consider. In the kitchen, I found a bottle of my grandfather's bourbon, still half full, and poured myself a generous measure. The burn in my throat was the first sensation that felt entirely normal since I'd arrived at Whispering Pines Farm. The phone in the kitchen was an old rotary model that seemed to belong in a museum, but when I lifted the receiver, I was surprised to hear a dial tone. I called information and asked for Dr. Sarah Williams' number, hoping she was still practicing in Millbrook Valley. She answered on the third ring, her voice cautious and slightly suspicious until I identified myself. "Juliet Chen," she said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "Henry told me you'd inherited the farm. I've been waiting for your call. We need to talk, but not on the phone. Can you meet me at my clinic tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock? I agreed, though I had no idea where her clinic was located or what she might tell me when I got there. After hanging up, I sat at my grandfather's kitchen table, bourbon in hand, staring out at the moonlit pastures where silent animals moved through their nightly routines. The documents I'd found suggested that whatever was happening at Whispering Pines Farm was the result of something my grandfather had discovered 20 years ago. Something in an old mine shaft. Something that had changed the animals in ways that required government oversight and veterinary monitoring. Something that created what the letter had called beneficial changes that were, quote, protecting something much larger than any of us understood. I thought about my grandfather's final note, the one that had told me to trust no one until I knew the truth. Looking around at the familiar kitchen where I'd eaten countless meals as a child, I realized that the man I'd thought I knew, the simple farmer who'd seemed to live his entire life according to the rhythms of agriculture and weather, had been keeping secrets that involved federal agencies and scientific research. As I finished my bourbon and prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at the edge of something much larger and more complex than a simple inheritance. The farm my grandfather had left me wasn't just land and livestock. It was the center of something that had been hidden from the world for 2 decades. Something that had transformed his animals and required the kind of secrecy that involved warnings about trusting neighbors. I climbed the stairs to what had always been my room during childhood visits, finding it exactly as I remembered. The twin bed with its patchwork quilt, the window that looked out over the main pasture, the small desk where I'd once written letters to friends back in Chicago. But now, instead of falling asleep to the familiar sounds of farm life, I lay awake in a silence so complete, it felt like being underwater. Outside my window, I could see the dark shapes of cattle moving slowly through the moonlit grass. Occasionally, one would lift its head toward the house, and I had the strange impression they were aware of my presence, aware that something had changed with my arrival. But they made no sound, none of them, and as I finally drifted off to sleep, I found myself wondering if I was the first human in 20 years to spend a night at Whispering Pines Farm, without understanding the true nature of the silence that surrounded me. Tomorrow, I would meet with Dr. Williams. Tomorrow, I would begin to understand what my grandfather had discovered in that mine shaft, what changes had been made to his animals, and what responsibilities I had inherited, along with 847 acres of impossibly quiet farmland. But tonight, I was simply a city woman lying in a childhood bed, listening to a silence so profound it felt like the entire world had forgotten how to make sound. I woke before dawn, pulled from restless sleep by what I initially thought was the sound of roosters crowing. But as consciousness sharpened, I realized the silence was still complete. My mind had simply conjured the familiar farm sounds from memory, so deeply ingrained were they from childhood mornings at Whispering Pines. The digital clock on the nightstand showed 5:47 a.m., and pale gray light was beginning to filter through the curtains. I dressed quickly in jeans and boots I'd brought from Chicago, clothes that felt foreign on a farm but were all I had. Outside my window, I could see the dark shapes of animals beginning their morning routines, moving through patterns that seemed normal until you noticed the absence of any accompanying sound. Downstairs, I started coffee in the ancient percolator I remembered from childhood visits, then stepped out onto the front porch to watch the sunrise paint the valley in shades of gold and amber. The beauty was unchanged from my memories. Rolling pastures dotted with cattle, horses grazing near the fence line, the distant mountains creating a natural boundary for this pocket of seeming paradise. But paradise didn't require government oversight and veterinary monitoring. Paradise didn't come with warnings about trusting neighbors or cryptic references to mine shafts and beneficial changes. As I sipped my coffee, watching a group of horses move silently across the upper pasture, I tried to reconcile the peaceful scene before me with the disturbing documents I'd found in my grandfather's study. Dr. Williams' veterinary clinic turned out to be a converted farmhouse about 10 miles from Whispering Pines, marked only by a small wooden sign that looked like it had been hand-painted decades ago. The building itself was unremarkable. White clapboard with green shutters and a wraparound porch that suggested it had once been someone's home. But the parking area behind the house held several vehicles that seemed out of place in rural Millbrook Valley, including a black SUV with government plates and what looked like a mobile laboratory unit. I parked next to a pickup truck and walked toward what appeared to be the main entrance, passing kennels that should have contained barking dogs but were eerily quiet. even the normal sounds of a veterinary practice, the whining of animals in distress or recovery, the chatter of staff members, were absent. The woman who answered my knock was in her 50s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of steady gaze that suggested she'd seen everything the rural veterinary world could offer. She wore a white lab coat over jeans and boots, and her handshake was firm and calloused. "Juliet," she said simply. "I'm Sarah Williams. Your grandfather spoke about you often, especially in his final months. Come in, we have a lot to discuss." The interior of the clinic had been extensively modified from its original residential layout. What had once been a living room now served as a waiting area, though it contained no chairs or typical veterinary office furniture. Instead, there were monitoring stations with computer screens, scientific equipment I didn't recognize, and walls lined with charts that looked more like research data than standard veterinary references. Dr. Williams led me through what had once been a dining room, now filled with laboratory benches and microscopes, into a back office that retained more of its original domestic character. She gestured for me to take a seat in one of 2 leather chairs positioned near a window that looked out over a pasture where silent cattle grazed. "I suppose you have questions," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "About the animals, about the documents you found, about what your grandfather was involved in here." "I have nothing but questions," I admitted, starting with why none of the animals on the farm make any sounds. Not just quiet sounds. No sounds at all. It's not natural. "You're right, it's not natural," Dr. Williams agreed. "But it's not harmful either, which is what took us nearly 5 years to establish. What your grandfather discovered 23 years ago changed everything we thought we knew about animal communication, environmental adaptation, and the relationship between sound and survival." She rose and moved to a filing cabinet, withdrawing a thick folder that she placed on the small table between our chairs. "The contents," she said, opening the folder to reveal photographs, scientific reports, and what appeared to be geological surveys, "are classified at the federal level, but as the heir to Whispering Pines Farm, you now have clearance to understand what you've inherited." The first photograph showed the entrance to what was clearly an old mine shaft, partially collapsed but still accessible. The black opening was surrounded by rough stone and supported by rotting timber that looked like it dated from the early 1900s. "Your grandfather found this while extending his fence line into the eastern section of the property," Dr. Williams explained. "The original survey maps from when his father purchased the land showed no mining activity, but this shaft appears to predate official records. Initial exploration suggested it was an abandoned silver mine from the 1890s. She turned to the next photograph, which showed the interior of the mine shaft. The image was taken with professional lighting equipment, revealing a tunnel that extended much deeper than I would have expected from a small regional mining operation. But what caught my attention were the walls themselves, which seemed to shimmer with an unusual coloration, as if they were coated with something that reflected light in unexpected ways. The first sign that something unusual was happening came when your grandfather's dog, Rex, fell into the mine shaft while they were examining the entrance. Dr. Williams continued. "Henry managed to get him out safely, but Rex never barked again. Not because he was injured or traumatized, but because he had apparently lost the physical ability to produce sound." I stared at the photograph, trying to understand the implications of what she was telling me. "Your grandfather brought Rex to me, concerned that the fall had damaged his vocal cords. But all my examinations showed that his throat and vocal apparatus were perfectly healthy. He would go through all the motions of barking, his mouth would open, his throat would work, but no sound would emerge." Over the next few weeks, Dr. Williams continued, turning to a page filled with what appeared to be chemical analysis reports. Other animals on the farm began exhibiting the same phenomenon. Not immediately and not all at once, but gradually every animal that spent time in the eastern pastures, the ones closest to the mine shaft, lost their ability to produce sound. The timeline she described matched what I'd observed during my childhood visits. I tried to remember the last time I'd heard normal farm sounds at Whispering Pines, and realized it had been during my early teens. By my later visits, the quiet had seemed natural, just part of the farm's peaceful atmosphere. "Your grandfather contacted me first, then the County Agricultural Extension Office, then the State Veterinary Services. Dr. Williams said. When they couldn't explain what was happening, federal agencies got involved. The Department of Agriculture, the Environmental Protection Agency, eventually the Centers for Disease Control. She turned to a page that showed what appeared to be a timeline of events, marked with dates and agency involvement. What we discovered, she said, pointing to entries marked with various scientific notations, was that the mine shaft contained deposits of a mineral compound that had never been cataloged before, something that had formed deep underground over thousands of years and was now being exposed to surface conditions for the first time in geological history. The compound, which they designated as element 47M, apparently had properties that affected the nervous system of mammals in very specific ways. Not harmful properties, Dr. Williams emphasized, but transformative ones. Animals exposed to even trace amounts through water, air, or soil contact experienced modifications to their auditory processing centers. I felt a chill as I began to understand what she was telling me. You're saying this mineral poisoned the animals? Not poisoned, she corrected firmly. Modified. The animals lost their ability to produce sound, but they gained something else. Enhanced sensory perception, increased intelligence, improved social cohesion. The changes were so beneficial that after the first 5 years of study, the government classified the site as a protected research environment rather than a contamination zone. She turned to a page filled with behavioral studies and cognitive testing results. The animals at Whispering Pines Farm demonstrated problem-solving abilities far beyond normal parameters for their species. They showed increased empathy, better stress management, longer lifespans, and resistance to diseases that typically affected farm animals. Your grandfather became, in effect, the curator of the most successful long-term animal behavioral modification study in history, Dr. Williams explained. The farm was transformed into a living laboratory, with the animals serving as willing participants in research that could revolutionize our understanding of animal intelligence and environmental adaptation. But why the secrecy, I asked. If the changes were beneficial, why hide it from the world? Dr. Williams closed the folder and looked at me with an expression that mixed sadness with resignation. Because the world isn't ready for what we discovered here, Juliet. The element 47M doesn't just affect animals. It affects humans too, but in ways that are far more complex and potentially controversial. She rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the silent cattle in the pasture. 3 researchers who spent extended time at the mine site experienced changes in their own auditory processing. Not loss of hearing or speech, but enhancement of their ability to perceive emotional states in others, to sense deception, to communicate through means that went beyond verbal language. The implications, she continued, were staggering. If element 47M could enhance human empathy and emotional intelligence, it could potentially address everything from violent crime to international conflict. But it could also be weaponized, used to create populations that were more compliant or easier to manipulate. I felt the weight of inherited responsibility settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. You're telling me that my grandfather was sitting on a discovery that could change human civilization, and he chose to keep it secret on a farm in rural Illinois? Your grandfather was protecting something more valuable than a scientific discovery, Dr. Williams said, turning back to face me. He was protecting the choice. The animals here chose to stay, even after the fencing was removed and they could have wandered away from the affected area. They recognized that something beneficial was happening to them, and they embraced it. She returned to her chair and opened the folder to a page I hadn't seen yet, filled with photographs of the animals engaging in behaviors that seemed impossible for their species. Horses working together to solve complex puzzles, cattle organizing themselves into sophisticated social structures, chickens displaying problem-solving abilities that rivaled those of dolphins. But humans, she continued, would likely be forced into exposure through government programs or corporate interests. Your grandfather believed that such an important evolutionary step should remain a choice, not a mandate imposed by authorities who might not have humanity's best interests at heart. The morning sun was now streaming through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air between us. I thought about the silent animals I had observed the previous night, their apparent health and contentment despite their unusual condition. What happens now? I asked. Now that I've inherited the farm, what am I supposed to do with this information? That depends on what kind of person you are, Dr. Williams replied. Your grandfather hoped that you would continue his work, maintaining the farm as a protected environment, while we continued to study the long-term effects of element 47M exposure. But he also prepared contingency plans if you decided the responsibility was too great. She reached into a desk drawer and withdrew a sealed envelope marked with my name in my grandfather's handwriting. This contains detailed instructions for either continuing the research or safely containing the mine site and relocating the animals to other facilities. The choice, as he always believed it should be, is yours. I stared at the envelope, understanding that opening it would commit me to a path I couldn't fully comprehend. Everything I thought I knew about my inheritance, about my grandfather, about the nature of the choice I faced had been transformed in the base of a single conversation. Dr. Williams seemed to sense my internal struggle. You don't have to decide today, she said gently. Take time to observe the animals, to understand what your grandfather built here. Walk the property, visit the mine site, see for yourself what 23 years of careful stewardship has created. But I should warn you, she added, her tone becoming more serious. There are people who know about Whispering Pines Farm, people in government and industry who would very much like to gain control of the element 47M deposits. Your grandfather's death has created an opportunity they've been waiting for. The transfer of ownership to you has bought us some time, but not much. As if summoned by her words, the sound of vehicles approaching interrupted our conversation. Through the window, I could see 2 black SUVs pulling into the parking area, followed by a sedan with government plates. Dr. Williams sighed and stood. And there they are now, she said. Agent Morrison from the Department of Agriculture and Dr. Elizabeth Harper from the Rural Research Initiative. They've been asking to meet with you since your grandfather's funeral. I felt a surge of anxiety as I watched suited figures emerging from the vehicles. These people knew more about my inheritance than I did, and they'd been waiting for my grandfather's death to make their move. Whatever protective measures he'd put in place during his lifetime were now gone, leaving me as the only barrier between Whispering Pines Farm and interests that might not share his vision of choice and protection. The knock on Dr. Williams' door came precisely at 9 o'clock, suggesting these were people accustomed to operating on strict schedules. As she went to answer it, I remained seated by the window, my grandfather's sealed envelope in my hands, watching the silent cattle continue their morning routines in blissful ignorance of the complex human politics surrounding their unique condition. Agent Morrison turned out to be a woman in her 40s with short blonde hair and the kind of professional demeanor that suggested extensive experience in situations that required both diplomacy and firmness. Dr. Harper was older, perhaps 60, with the slightly distracted air of someone whose mind was constantly processing complex scientific data. Miss Chen, Agent Morrison said as Dr. Williams led them into the office, thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I know this is a difficult time, dealing with your grandfather's death and the unexpected inheritance of such a unique property. I hadn't actually agreed to meet with them, but I didn't correct her assumption. Instead, I remained seated and waited for them to explain their presence and their interest in my farm. Dr. Harper spoke next, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of a researcher who'd spent decades studying phenomena that excited her beyond normal professional boundaries. Your grandfather was a remarkable man, Miss Chen. The work he did at Whispering Pines Farm represents one of the most significant discoveries in the history of agricultural and behavioral science. Agent Morrison shot her colleague a look that suggested they'd agreed on a different approach to this conversation. What Dr. Harper means, she said smoothly, is that your inheritance includes certain federal research partnerships that we'd like to continue with your permission. I looked at Dr. Williams, who had taken a seat near the door, her expression carefully neutral. What kind of partnerships? I asked. Dr. Harper leaned forward eagerly. The element 47M deposits on your property have given us insights into animal behavior modification that could revolutionize everything from livestock management to wildlife conservation. With proper development, we could create environments that enhance animal welfare while increasing agricultural productivity. Agent Morrison nodded in agreement. The federal government has a significant investment in the research conducted at Whispering Pines Farm. We'd like to formalize that relationship, perhaps through a long-term lease arrangement that would provide you with substantial compensation, while allowing our scientists continued access to the site. I thought about my grandfather's warning to trust no one in Millbrook Valley until I knew the truth. These people, with their government credentials and scientific enthusiasm, seemed trustworthy enough. But something in their eagerness, in the speed with which they'd arrived after Dr. Williams had explained the situation to me, suggested they'd been planning this conversation for some time. What would happen to the animals, I asked, if you formalized this research partnership? Dr. Harper's eyes lit up. That's the beautiful part, Miss Chen. The animals would remain exactly where they are, continuing to thrive in their enhanced state while providing us with ongoing data about long-term exposure effects. We might add some additional monitoring equipment, perhaps introduce new test subjects to study the progression of changes, but essentially nothing would change from the animals' perspective. Nothing would change except that they would become laboratory subjects rather than the protected population my grandfather had been maintaining. I began to understand why he'd chosen secrecy over official recognition, why he'd preferred the quiet stewardship of a single farm to the scrutiny of institutional research. I need time to consider this, I said finally. The inheritance is still very new to me, and I want to understand all my options before making any commitments. Agent Morrison's smile remained professional, but I caught a flicker of impatience in her eyes. Of course, Miss Chen, take all the time you need. But I should mention that there are certain regulatory requirements associated with properties containing undocumented mineral deposits. The longer formal arrangements remain undefined, the more difficult it becomes to maintain the current protection status of the site. The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. Cooperate with their research program, or face regulatory challenges that could force me to abandon the farm entirely. Dr. Harper seemed oblivious to her colleague's subtle intimidation tactics. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder similar to the one Dr. Williams had shown me earlier. This contains detailed proposals for expanding the research program, she said, placing it on the table. Equipment specifications, staffing plans, budget projections. I think you'll find our vision for Whispering Pines Farm quite exciting. I accepted the folder without opening it, adding it to the growing collection of documents that defined my inheritance in terms I was still learning to understand. Thank you, I said. I'll review everything carefully. As they prepared to leave, Agent Morrison handed me her business card. Please don't hesitate to call if you have any questions, Miss Chen. And please remember that your grandfather's work here is too important to be left without proper oversight. We're here to help ensure that his legacy continues in the most beneficial way possible. After they left, Dr. Williams and I sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the distant sounds of vehicles departing and normal clinic operations resuming in other parts of the building. Well, Dr. Williams said finally, now you've met the people your grandfather was protecting the farm from, what do you think? I think they want to turn Whispering Pines into a corporate research facility, I replied. And I think they're prepared to use regulatory pressure to get what they want if I don't cooperate voluntarily. Dr. Williams nodded grimly. Your grandfather faced similar pressure for over 20 years. He developed strategies for managing their interest while maintaining control of the site, but those strategies depended on his deep knowledge of the animals and the mineral deposits. You're starting from a much more vulnerable position. She handed me another business card, this one for a law firm in Springfield. James Mitchell specializes in environmental law and federal regulatory compliance, she said. Your grandfather retained his services for situations exactly like this one. If you decide to resist the government's expansion plans, you'll need legal representation that understands the complexities involved. I pocketed the card along with Agent Morrison's, feeling like I was collecting the contact information for a battle I hadn't known I was going to have to fight. When I woke up yesterday morning, in my Chicago apartment, my biggest concern had been a marketing presentation for a client who sold overpriced fitness equipment. Now, I was apparently responsible for protecting a unique ecosystem and the animals within it from people who saw them as research subjects, rather than living beings who'd made their own choice about their evolutionary path. The drive back to Whispering Pines Farm gave me time to process everything I'd learned, But the more I understood about my inheritance, the more complex it became. The animals weren't just silent, they were transformed. The mine shaft wasn't just an interesting geological feature, it was the source of a mineral compound that could potentially change human civilization. And my grandfather wasn't just a farmer, he was the guardian of secrets that powerful people were determined to unlock. As I turned into the familiar driveway, I noticed something I'd missed the previous evening. Security cameras, discreetly positioned but clearly professional grade, monitored the entrance to the property. Similar cameras were visible along the fence line, suggesting a surveillance system far more sophisticated than anything a typical farmer would need. The animals in the pastures seemed more alert than they had the night before, as if they sensed the changes that my presence was bringing to their protected environment. Several horses gathered near the fence as I drove past, and I had the odd impression they were studying me, evaluating whether I was someone they could trust with their welfare. Inside the farmhouse, I spread all the documents I'd collected across the kitchen table, trying to organize them into some coherent understanding of what I'd inherited. Government reports, veterinary studies, legal documents, research proposals, and my grandfather's personal notes created a complex picture of a man who dedicated the final decades of his life to protecting something he believed was more important than his own interests. The sealed envelope Dr. Williams had given me sat unopened among the papers, my grandfather's final guidance waiting for me to decide whether I was ready to accept the full weight of his legacy. Outside the kitchen window, I could see cattle moving through their afternoon routines in perfect silence, adapted to a life that had been transformed by circumstances beyond their control but which they had apparently embraced as an improvement over their original condition. I thought about Agent Morrison's veiled threats, and Dr. Harper's enthusiasm for expanded research. I thought about Dr. Williams' decades of careful monitoring, and my grandfather's 23 years of protective stewardship. Most of all, I thought about the choice that now faced me, a choice that would determine not just the future of Whispering Pines Farm, but potentially the future of a discovery that could reshape human understanding of consciousness, communication, and the relationship between different species. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the kitchen windows when I finally opened my grandfather's envelope and began to read the detailed instructions he'd left for the granddaughter he'd hoped would understand the true value of what he'd spent his life protecting. My grandfather's letter contained instructions that read like a manual for protecting state secrets. Hidden compartments throughout the farmhouse contained backup documentation, encrypted communication devices, and contact information for a network of researchers and legal advocates I'd never known existed. But what shocked me most was the revelation that I wasn't inheriting this responsibility alone. 3 other farms across the Midwest had been quietly conducting similar research under my grandfather's coordination. Properties in Nebraska, Iowa, and Missouri, where trusted families had been gradually introducing element 47M into controlled environments, creating a distributed network of research sites that no single government agency could easily commandeer. The letter explained that these allied farms had been developing different aspects of the research. While Whispering Pines focused on large livestock, the Nebraska operations studied small mammals, Iowa concentrated on poultry, and Missouri examined the effects on wildlife populations. Together, they formed a comprehensive picture of how element 47M affected different species and ecosystems. But the letter also contained darker information. 2 other farms had been discovered by federal agencies in the past decade. One in Wyoming had been seized under eminent domain and converted into a government research facility. The other, in Montana, had been abandoned by its owners after they faced bankruptcy from legal challenges and regulatory pressure. I was reading about the Wyoming confiscation when my phone finally picked up a signal and began buzzing with missed messages. 3 voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize, 2 texts from Dr. Williams, and a missed call from the Springfield law office she'd recommended. The messages painted a picture of rapidly escalating pressure. The first voicemail was from someone identifying himself as a reporter for Agricultural Today magazine, asking about rumors of unusual livestock research at Whispering Pines Farm. The second was from a property developer offering to purchase the farm for substantially more than its agricultural value. The third was Agent Morrison, her voice tighter than it had been during our morning meeting, requesting an urgent callback to discuss, quote, time-sensitive regulatory matters. Dr. Williams' texts were more direct. Media inquiries started this afternoon. Someone leaked information about your inheritance. Call me immediately. The follow-up message was even more concerning. Government vehicles observed at eastern property boundary. May be conducting unauthorized surveys. I grabbed my grandfather's binoculars from the kitchen drawer and headed for the upstairs bedroom that faced east toward the mine site. From that vantage point, I could see across several pastures to the tree line that marked the boundary of the property. Sure enough, 3 vehicles were parked along the county road, and I could see figures moving through the woods with what appeared to be surveying equipment. They weren't on my property yet, but they were clearly preparing for something. The sight of government agents conducting operations near the mine site without my permission filled me with a combination of anger and fear. My grandfather had spent 23 years protecting this place, and they'd waited exactly 1 day after meeting with me to begin their own investigations. I called Dr. Williams first, catching her as she was closing her clinic for the day. The media attention started about an hour after Morrison and Harper left my office, she said without preamble. Someone in their group contacted reporters, probably to increase pressure on you to cooperate with their research program. Can they legally survey the property without my permission? I asked, watching the distant figures through the binoculars. Not technically, Dr. Williams replied, but they can gather information from adjacent public land. If they claim they're investigating potential environmental hazards or conducting routine geological surveys, it becomes very difficult to stop them legally. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Juliet, there's something else you need to know. I made some calls after our meeting this morning, reached out to contacts at other research institutions. There's been increased government interest in behavioral modification research across multiple agencies. Not just agriculture and the CDC, but Defense Department and Homeland Security as well. The implication hit me like cold water. They weren't just interested in improving livestock management or wildlife conservation. They saw Element 47M as a potential tool for human behavioral control, exactly the scenario my grandfather had warned against. What do I do? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the situation I'd inherited. Tonight, you do nothing, Dr. Williams advised. Let them conduct their surveys from public land while you prepare your response. Tomorrow, we meet with James Mitchell and develop a legal strategy. But Juliet, you need to understand that once you resist their program officially, there's no going back. They'll use every regulatory tool available to force compliance. After hanging up, I called the Springfield Law Office and managed to reach James Mitchell directly. He had a voice like gravel, and the kind of direct manner that suggested he'd spent decades fighting battles against government overreach. Your grandfather was a good man and a smart strategist, he said after I explained the situation. He prepared for this scenario extensively. I have sealed documents that will help protect your ownership rights, but we need to file them before any formal seizure proceedings begin. How long do we have? I asked. Depends on how aggressive they want to be, Mitchell replied. If they follow standard procedures, we have weeks or months. If they declare an environmental emergency or national security interest, we could have days. The fact that they're already conducting surveys suggests they're preparing to move quickly. I scheduled a meeting with Mitchell for the following morning, then spent the remainder of the afternoon walking the property and trying to understand what I was fighting to protect. The animals seemed more aware of my presence than they had previously, following my movements with alert attention. Several horses approached the fence line as I passed, and I noticed they positioned themselves in ways that blocked the view from the eastern boundary where the government vehicles remained stationed. The cattle exhibited similar behavior, clustering in areas that would make it difficult for distant observers to get clear photographs or video of their unusual silence. It was as if they understood that they were being watched, and were actively participating in maintaining the secrecy that had protected them for over 2 decades. I walked to the mine entrance for the first time, following a path that was clearly well maintained, despite my grandfather's attempts to keep the site concealed. The opening was exactly as Dr. Williams had described, partially collapsed but still accessible, surrounded by the kind of warning signs that suggested extreme danger rather than scientific interest. But what struck me most was the air around the mine site. It felt different somehow, charged with energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. The silence here was even more profound than elsewhere on the property, as if sound itself was absorbed before it could propagate. When I dropped a small stone into the opening, I saw it fall but heard nothing when it hit bottom. I spent nearly an hour at the mine site, trying to understand how such a small geological formation could have such profound effects on the animals throughout the farm. The research documents had mentioned trace amounts of element 47M spreading through groundwater and soil contact, but experiencing the intensity of the effect at its source gave me a new appreciation for the power of what my grandfather had been managing. As evening approached, I noticed the government vehicles finally departing from the county road, but I had no doubt they'd be back with more sophisticated equipment and probably legal authorization for closer examination. The brief reprieve gave me time to explore the hidden compartments my grandfather had mentioned in his letter. The first was behind a false panel in the basement, containing backup copies of all research data and correspondence with the other allied farms. The second was more disturbing, a weapons cache that included rifles, ammunition, and night vision equipment that suggested my grandfather had been prepared for more serious resistance than legal challenges. The third compartment, hidden behind books in his study, contained something that changed my entire understanding of the situation. Personal journals dating back 23 years, detailing not just the discovery of element 47M and its effects on animals, but my grandfather's own gradual exposure to the compound and the changes it had produced in him. The early entries read like standard farm journals recording weather conditions, animal health, crop rotation schedules. But as the months progressed after the mine shaft discovery, the entries became more detailed, more insightful, and increasingly focused on the emotional states and behavioral patterns of his animals. By the second year, he was writing about sensing their thoughts and feelings, about understanding their needs and desires in ways that went far beyond normal animal husbandry. By the fifth year, he was describing a form of communication with the animals that didn't require sound or traditional signals, a direct emotional and intellectual connection that allowed him to coordinate complex farm operations through pure intention. The later entries were even more remarkable. My grandfather described developing enhanced empathy, not just for animals, but for all living things. He wrote about sensing the health of his crops, the condition of soil organisms, even the emotional states of wild animals that visited the property. The element 47M hadn't just affected his livestock, it had transformed him into something approaching a living ecosystem coordinator. But the final entries, written in the months before his death, revealed the cost of these enhancements. The constant awareness of every living thing on the property had become overwhelming. He described feeling the pain of injured animals, the stress of plants during droughts, the complex social dynamics of insect populations. The expanded consciousness that element 47M provided came with a burden of awareness that human minds weren't designed to process. Reading his journals, I began to understand why he'd been so careful about controlling exposure to element 47M and why he'd resisted government research programs. The changes weren't just beneficial, they were fundamentally transformative in ways that could be psychologically devastating if not carefully managed. I also understood why he'd chosen me as his heir. The final entry in his journal was addressed directly to me, written just weeks before his death. Juliet, he'd written, "If you're reading this, then the choice I've been protecting for 23 years is now yours to make. You have the education to understand the science, the moral foundation to resist those who would exploit these discoveries, and the emotional strength to handle the responsibility I'm passing to you. The animals trust you, they always have. Even as a child, you moved through their world with a gentleness and respect that marked you as someone who could be entrusted with their welfare. But more importantly, you have the independence to make this choice freely, without the family obligations or professional pressures that might compromise your judgment. The element 47M will affect you too, if you choose to stay at Whispering Pines and work closely with the animals. The changes are gradual but profound, and you should understand what you're accepting before you commit to this path. Enhanced empathy, expanded awareness, deeper connection to all living systems on the property. These gifts come with responsibilities that will reshape your entire relationship with the natural world. But if you choose to accept these changes, you'll become the guardian of something unprecedented in human history. A voluntary evolutionary step toward greater consciousness and connection. preserved as a choice, rather than imposed as a requirement. The government agents who will come after my death see Element 47M as a tool for behavioral control or agricultural productivity. They don't understand that its true value lies in demonstrating that consciousness itself can be expanded without losing individual autonomy or free will. Protect the animals, protect the choice, and, if you're willing, protect yourself by accepting the transformation that comes with true guardianship of this remarkable place. I closed the journal as full darkness settled over Whispering Pines Farm, my grandfather's words echoing in my mind as I watched the silent animals settling into their nighttime routines. Outside, security lights activated automatically, illuminating the barn complex and main pastures with a soft glow that suggested the property was far more secure than its rural appearance indicated. My phone buzzed with another message from Dr. Williams. Mitchell called. Emergency meeting tomorrow at 7 a.m. Federal task force being assembled. Time running out. I walked through the quiet house, turning off lights and securing doors according to procedures I found detailed in my grandfather's security manual. The responsibility I'd inherited was far greater than I'd imagined when I'd first read the legal documents, but so was the opportunity to protect something that could represent a new form of human consciousness. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I realized that the choice my grandfather had written about wasn't just about whether to resist government control of the property. It was about whether I was willing to undergo the same transformation he had experienced, to become something more than human in order to serve as guardian for animals who had already made that evolutionary leap. The next morning would bring legal battles, media attention, and increasing pressure from forces that saw Whispering Pines Farm as a resource to be exploited, rather than a sanctuary to be protected. But tonight, I lay in my childhood bed, listening to the profound silence of transformed animals, and feeling the first subtle changes in my own awareness, as 23 years of Element 47M exposure in the environment began to work its gradual magic on another generation of the family that had chosen to serve as its protector. I dreamed of conversations without words, of understanding that transcended species boundaries, and of a responsibility that would require me to become something I'd never imagined when I drove away from Chicago, with nothing more complicated on my mind than settling an estate and returning to my corporate marketing job. When I woke the next morning, I could sense the emotional state of every animal on the property, and I knew that my grandfather's transformation had begun in me as well. The emergency meeting with James Mitchell took place in a conference room that looked like it had been designed for war councils, rather than legal consultations. Maps of Whispering Pines Farm covered one wall, marked with property boundaries, geological surveys, and federal jurisdiction markers. Mitchell had assembled a team that included environmental lawyers, a former EPA administrator, and someone he introduced only as a specialist in government overreach cases. The federal task force moved faster than we anticipated, Mitchell began without preamble. They filed environmental impact assessments and public health concerns with 3 different agencies simultaneously. It's a coordinated strategy designed to overwhelm our ability to respond through normal legal channels. Dr. Williams sat across from me, her expression grim as she reviewed documents that had been served to her clinic at dawn. They're claiming that unregulated mineral exposure poses a threat to regional groundwater systems, she explained. The health department wants to quarantine the entire farm while they conduct their own testing. But the most concerning development came from the specialist Mitchell had brought, a woman named Catherine Reed, who had spent 20 years fighting government seizures of private property. She spread photographs across the conference table showing military vehicles positioned just outside Millbrook Valley. This isn't just about research anymore, she said. Someone high up in the chain of command has classified Element 47M as a matter of national security. They're treating Whispering Pines Farm like it contains weapons-grade material rather than enhanced livestock. Mitchell leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped on the table. Juliet, you need to understand what you're facing. If they invoke national security protocols, they can seize the property immediately and hold it indefinitely while conducting their investigations. Your legal rights become secondary to what they claim are security concerns. I felt the familiar weight of inherited responsibility settling deeper into my shoulders. What are my options? We can fight them in court, Mitchell replied. But that could take years and might not succeed if they've classified the mineral as strategically important. We can negotiate a controlled research partnership that preserves some of your rights, while giving them limited access. Or we can implement your grandfather's contingency plan. He withdrew a sealed file from his briefcase, marked with security tape and my grandfather's signature. This contains instructions for completely containing the Element 47M site and relocating all affected animals to the allied farms in other states. It would eliminate the government's justification for seizing Whispering Pines, but it would also end the research program your grandfather spent decades developing. Dr. Williams shook her head firmly. The animals can't be relocated, James. After 23 years of adaptation, removing them from the Element 47M environment could be fatal. Their nervous systems have been fundamentally altered. They need the ongoing mineral exposure to maintain their enhanced cognitive functions. Then we fight, I said, surprising myself with the decisiveness in my voice. I won't let them turn my grandfather's sanctuary into a government laboratory, and I won't sacrifice the animals for the sake of avoiding legal battles. Catherine Reed smiled for the first time since the meeting began. That's what I was hoping you'd say. Your grandfather prepared well for this scenario. We have strategies that have worked in similar cases, but they require complete commitment from you and perfect execution from all of us. She opened a laptop and began showing me documents I'd never seen before, legal instruments that had been prepared years in advance for exactly this situation, trust formations that would transfer ownership of the farm to a protected environmental foundation, scientific certifications from international researchers that supported the beneficial nature of the Element 47M effects, media contacts who specialized in exposing government overreach stories. But the most important element of the strategy was something I hadn't expected. We're going public, Reed explained. Complete transparency about the research, the government pressure, and your choice to protect the animals' welfare over federal research interests. Once the story breaks nationally, it becomes much harder for them to use covert tactics. Mitchell nodded agreement. Your grandfather always believed that secrecy was a temporary protective measure, not a permanent solution. If we're going to fight for the principle of voluntary evolutionary enhancement, we need public support for that principle. The plan they outlined was complex and risky: simultaneous filing of legal challenges to halt the government seizure, coordination with environmental groups and animal rights organizations to create public pressure, release of research data to international scientific journals to prevent the government from suppressing the discoveries, and most challenging of all, my own public testimony about the beneficial effects of Element 47M exposure on both animals and humans. I spent the rest of that morning recording video statements that would be released if the government moved to seize the farm. Sitting in that sterile conference room, looking directly into a camera lens, I tried to explain why a mineral compound that most people had never heard of was worth fighting the federal government to protect. My grandfather spent 23 years proving that consciousness can be enhanced without losing individuality or free will, I said to the camera. The animals at Whispering Pines Farm chose to embrace changes that made them more intelligent, more empathetic, more connected to their environment. They weren't forced into these modifications, they welcomed them because they recognized the benefits. Now government agencies want to study these animals like laboratory specimens, to control their environment, and possibly to weaponize the discoveries my grandfather made. I'm fighting to preserve their right to exist as enhanced beings rather than research subjects, and to protect humanity's right to choose our own evolutionary path rather than having it imposed by institutions that may not have our best interests at heart. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, but I knew they were true. In just 3 days at Whispering Pines Farm, I had begun to experience the subtle changes that Element 47M produced in human consciousness. The enhanced awareness of the animal's emotional states, the deeper connection to natural systems, the expansion of empathy beyond normal human limits. These weren't side effects to be studied, they were gifts to be treasured and protected. By the time I returned to the farm that afternoon, the siege had begun in earnest. Government vehicles lined the county road, and news vans had joined them, as word of the story began to leak to media outlets. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, government officials and supporters who had learned about the situation through networks I didn't know existed. But the most significant development was happening among the animals themselves. As I walked through the pastures, I could sense an unusual alertness in their behavior. The cattle had formed defensive clusters around their calves. The horses were positioning themselves with clear sight lines to the property boundaries. Even the chickens had altered their patterns, staying closer to cover and moving with more caution than I'd observed during my previous visits. They knew something was happening, and they were responding with coordinated defensive behaviors that suggested a level of strategic thinking far beyond normal animal capabilities. The Element 47M hadn't just enhanced their individual intelligence, it had enabled sophisticated group coordination that allowed them to function as a unified protective system. Dr. Williams arrived as I was observing this phenomenon, bringing with her a colleague I hadn't met before. "This is Dr. Michael Torres from the University of California," she explained. "He's been studying group intelligence in enhanced animal populations for the past 5 years." Dr. Torres was a compact man in his 40s, with the intense focus of someone who had dedicated his career to understanding phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness and communication. "What you're witnessing," he said, "watching the coordinated movements of animals throughout the property is unprecedented in the scientific literature." He pointed toward a group of horses that were moving in precise formation along the eastern fence line. "They're not just individually more intelligent, they're functioning as a collective intelligence network. Each animal is sharing sensory information and emotional states with the others, creating a farm-wide awareness system that allows them to respond to threats with remarkable coordination." The implications of what he was describing hit me like a physical blow. The government wasn't just interested in studying enhanced individual animals, they wanted to understand and potentially control collective intelligence networks that could revolutionize everything from military operations to social organization. Dr. Torres continued his explanation as we watched the animals maintaining their defensive positions. "Your grandfather's journals describe similar collective behaviors developing gradually over the years. What started as individual enhancement became group consciousness, and eventually evolved into something approaching a single distributed intelligence that encompasses the entire farm ecosystem. If the government gains control of this research," Dr. Williams added grimly, "they won't just study the animals. They'll attempt to replicate the conditions that created collective intelligence, possibly with human subjects. The Defense Department applications alone would be worth billions." As evening approached, the situation escalated dramatically. A convoy of military vehicles arrived and began establishing what appeared to be a command post on adjacent public land. Spotlights were being positioned to illuminate the property boundaries, and I could see personnel setting up sophisticated surveillance equipment that would monitor every movement on the farm. My phone rang with a call from Agent Morrison, her voice carrying new authority that suggested she was no longer just a Department of Agriculture representative. "Miss Chen, we need to meet immediately to discuss the evolving security situation at your property. There are national security implications that require your immediate cooperation." "I'm represented by counsel now," I replied, following the script Mitchell had prepared. "All communication should go through my legal team." "This has moved beyond legal representation," Morrison responded sharply. "We have credible intelligence suggesting that foreign governments are aware of the research conducted at Whispering Pines Farm. Your continued resistance to federal oversight is creating a security vulnerability that threatens national interests." The accusation was clearly designed to justify more aggressive action, but it also revealed how seriously they were taking the situation. Element 47M wasn't just interesting to agricultural researchers and behavioral scientists. It had attracted attention from intelligence agencies and military planners, who saw its potential for applications I was only beginning to understand. That night, as military spotlights swept across the property and surveillance drones buzzed overhead, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible when I first inherited the farm. I walked out to the main pasture and stood among the silent cattle, opening my mind to the collective awareness that my grandfather's journals had described. The connection came gradually, like slowly tuning into a radio frequency that had always been broadcasting, but which I'd never known how to receive. First, I became aware of the emotional states of individual animals nearby. Calm alertness from the cattle, protective vigilance from the horses, nervous energy from the chickens. Then the awareness expanded to encompass animals throughout the property, creating a three-dimensional map of consciousness that covered every acre of Whispering Pines Farm. But the most remarkable discovery was that the animals were aware of me joining their network. I felt their recognition of my presence and their shared consciousness, their acceptance of me as someone who could be trusted with their collective thoughts and feelings. They had been waiting for me to develop enough sensitivity to join them fully, to become part of the protective intelligence that my grandfather had helped create over more than 2 decades. Through their enhanced senses, I experienced the property as they did. I felt the vibrations of military vehicles on distant roads, sensed the electromagnetic signatures of surveillance equipment, perceived the stress and aggression of the personnel who were preparing to invade their sanctuary. But I also felt their determination to resist, their collective decision to protect their home and their way of life regardless of the cost. The animals weren't just subjects in a research program, they were partners in a revolutionary expansion of consciousness that offered humanity a glimpse of what we could become if we chose enhancement over exploitation. My grandfather had recognized this partnership and had dedicated his life to protecting it. Now that responsibility was mine, and I understood that accepting it meant becoming something more than the marketing executive who had driven out from Chicago just days before. Over the following hours, as military preparations continued around the property perimeter, I worked with the collective animal intelligence to coordinate defensive measures that my grandfather had planned but never needed to implement. Hidden cameras were activated to document any illegal entry onto the property. Communication systems were tested to ensure contact with allied farms and legal representatives. Most importantly, protocols were established for protecting the animals if the government attempted forcible seizure of the property. The animals had contingency plans I couldn't have imagined, strategies that took advantage of their enhanced intelligence and coordination abilities. Underground tunnels that connected distant parts of the property, hidden shelters that could conceal entire herds, and communication networks that could coordinate complex movements without any external signals that government forces could intercept. As dawn approached, I realized that Whispering Pines Farm wasn't just a research site or a sanctuary. It was a functioning example of post-human consciousness applied to practical challenges. The collective intelligence that encompassed every animal on the property represented an evolutionary leap that governments and corporations around the world would kill to control. But they had underestimated both the animals and the humans who had chosen to protect them. My grandfather had spent decades preparing for this confrontation, and the defense systems he had created were far more sophisticated than the federal agencies attacking us realized. The final battle for Whispering Pines Farm was about to begin, and I was no longer just Juliet Chen, inheritance recipient and reluctant property owner. I had become part of something larger, something that represented humanity's potential future if we had the courage to choose enhancement over exploitation, cooperation over domination, and expanded consciousness over the limitations that had defined our species for millennia. The morning sun revealed military positions that surrounded the property on 3 sides, but it also illuminated a farm where every animal was positioned with strategic precision, where underground networks had been preparing for this moment for over 20 years, and where the first human-animal collective intelligence partnership in history was ready to defend itself against forces that saw it as a resource to be harvested, rather than a miracle to be protected. The standoff began at precisely 6 a.m. when federal agents crossed onto my property without warrants, claiming emergency authority under national security provisions I'd never heard of. But they hadn't anticipated the response they received from what they assumed were ordinary farm animals. The first wave of agents encountered cattle that moved with tactical precision, positioning themselves to block access routes while never directly threatening the intruders. Horses formed secondary perimeters that channeled the agents into specific areas where hidden cameras documented every move. Even the chickens contributed to the defense, creating enough commotion to mask the sounds of larger animals repositioning themselves according to strategies that had been refined over years of preparation. I watched from the farmhouse as Agent Morrison approached with a team of armed personnel, her expression confident, until she realized that every animal on the property was watching her with intelligence that made her visibly uncomfortable. The collective awareness I had joined the night before allowed me to experience her growing unease as she recognized that these weren't typical livestock responding to strange humans on their territory. "Miss Chen," she called from 50 yards away, her voice carrying less authority than I'd heard during our previous encounters. "We have lawful authority to conduct safety inspections on this property. Please instruct your animals to allow our personnel safe passage." The request revealed how completely they had underestimated the situation. The animals weren't under my control, they were partners in a defensive operation that relied on their enhanced intelligence and coordination abilities. I couldn't instruct them to do anything, but I could communicate with them through the shared consciousness network that now included me as a full participant. Through that network, I felt the collective decision being made by every animal on the farm. They would not resist with violence, but they would not cooperate with efforts to transform their sanctuary into a research facility. The defense would be passive but absolute, making it impossible for the agents to accomplish their mission while avoiding any actions that could justify violent responses. Morrison's team spent 3 hours attempting to reach the barn complex, but found every approach blocked by animals that simply wouldn't move out of their way. When they tried to force passages, the animals repositioned themselves with fluid coordination that maintained the blockades without creating direct confrontations. It was collective resistance at a level that challenged everything the agents thought they understood about animal behavior. By noon, military reinforcements had arrived, along with equipment designed to handle what they clearly now recognized as an unprecedented situation. But they also brought something I hadn't expected. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the researcher who had visited me earlier, now accompanied by colleagues from universities across the country. The scientific community had mobilized in response to the story going public, and what had begun as a government seizure operation was becoming an international incident. Researchers who had spent decades studying animal intelligence were demanding access to observe the phenomenon at Whispering Pines Farm, while animal rights organizations were filing injunctions to prevent any actions that might harm the enhanced animals. James Mitchell called as the military was setting up what appeared to be a command center in the adjacent field. "The media response exceeded our expectations," he reported, with satisfaction I could hear even over the phone. CNN, BBC, National Geographic, they're all sending teams. The government can't use covert tactics when the world is watching. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Dr. Torres, the researcher who had explained the collective intelligence phenomenon, approached the farmhouse under a flag of truce, accompanied by representatives from the United Nations Environmental Program. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice carrying excitement that bordered on reverence, "what's happening here represents the most important discovery in the history of consciousness research. The international scientific community is prepared to offer protection and funding for continued research under civilian oversight rather than military control." The UN representatives, a woman named Dr. Patricia Voss, and a man introduced as Ambassador Chen, no relation, presented documents that outlined a possible resolution to the standoff: international recognition of Whispering Pines Farm as a protected research site, similar to national parks but specifically designated for studying enhanced consciousness in animal populations. The proposal would remove the property from U.S. government control and place it under international scientific oversight, with guaranteed protection for the animals and continued research under ethical guidelines established by a consortium of universities and environmental organizations. It was an elegant solution that addressed most of my concerns, while providing the animals with protections that went far beyond anything my grandfather had been able to arrange through secrecy and legal maneuvering. But it also meant accepting permanent transformation of the farm from a private sanctuary into a public research facility, albeit one designed to serve scientific understanding rather than military applications. I consulted the collective consciousness before responding, opening my awareness to the thoughts and feelings of every animal on the property. Their response was immediate and unanimous. They were willing to accept international oversight if it meant protection from government seizure and continued research that respected their enhanced intelligence, rather than treating them as specimens. The negotiations took place in the farmhouse kitchen where I'd eaten countless childhood meals with my grandfather. But now the table was surrounded by diplomats, scientists, military officials, and legal representatives, working to resolve a situation that had no precedent in international law. The final agreement established the Whispering Pines Consciousness Research Preserve as an internationally protected site administered by a consortium of universities and environmental organizations. The animals would remain in their enhanced state under careful monitoring, while research into Element 47M would continue under ethical guidelines that respected their intelligence and autonomy. Most importantly for me, I would remain as the primary guardian of the site, working with international researchers but maintaining the protective relationship my grandfather had established with the enhanced animal community. The transformation I was undergoing would be studied as well, providing insights into human consciousness enhancement that could inform future research while respecting my choice to serve as a bridge between species. The military withdrawal began immediately after the agreement was signed, replaced by research teams from universities around the world who approached the farm with the reverence appropriate for a site that had revolutionized understanding of consciousness and intelligence. Dr. Williams, who had fought beside me throughout the crisis, expressed amazement at how quickly the situation had been resolved once the international community became involved. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said as we watched the last government vehicles departing. "He protected this place for 23 years so that humanity would have the choice to embrace enhancement voluntarily, rather than having it imposed by institutions with their own agendas." The months that followed transformed Whispering Pines from a hidden sanctuary into a carefully managed research site that attracted scientists, philosophers, and consciousness researchers from every continent. But the most remarkable aspect of the transformation was how little changed for the animals themselves. They continued their enhanced lives much as they had before. But now their intelligence and coordination abilities were studied with the respect they deserved, rather than the exploitation they had narrowly avoided. Research teams worked to understand how Element 47M produced its effects, while others studied the collective consciousness network that had emerged from decades of gradual enhancement. My own transformation continued under careful monitoring, providing unprecedented data about human consciousness enhancement in real time. The changes were profound but gradual, expanding my awareness and empathy while preserving my individual identity and free will. I became living proof that consciousness could be enhanced without losing the qualities that made human experience meaningful. The research conducted at Whispering Pines began producing insights that revolutionized fields from neuroscience to philosophy, while the international protection status ensured that the discoveries would benefit humanity as a whole, rather than serving narrow institutional interests. Element 47M deposits were eventually discovered at other locations around the world, but the protocols developed at Whispering Pines ensured that each site was developed under international oversight, with full respect for any animals or ecosystems that might be affected by exposure. Most importantly, the principle my grandfather had died protecting was preserved. Consciousness enhancement remained a choice rather than a mandate. Humans who wished to experience the expanded awareness that Element 47M provided could do so under careful medical supervision, while those who preferred their unenhanced state were free to make that choice without pressure or discrimination. I stand now in the same pasture where I first experienced the profound silence that had seemed so disturbing when I arrived to claim my inheritance. But I understand now that the silence wasn't an absence of communication. It was the presence of a form of consciousness that transcended the limitations of sound-based language. The animals around me continue their enhanced lives, partners in a grand experiment in expanded awareness that has changed how humanity understands the potential for consciousness evolution. My grandfather's legacy has become the foundation for a new chapter in human development, one based on choice, respect, and the recognition that intelligence takes many forms beyond those we had previously recognized. The farm that I inherited thinking it was a simple agricultural property has become the birthplace of post-human consciousness research, proving that the most profound discoveries often come from the most unexpected places. And the animals that I thought were simply silent have become teachers, showing humanity what we might become if we have the courage to embrace enhancement while preserving the choice that makes such enhancement meaningful. As I write these final words, looking out over pastures where enhanced animals graze in peaceful coordination with research teams that study their remarkable abilities, I understand that my grandfather's greatest gift wasn't the property or the animals, or even the discovery of Element 47M. It was the example he set of choosing protection over exploitation, understanding over control, and the faith that humanity would ultimately choose enhancement over domination when given the opportunity to make that choice freely. The silence that once seemed so mysterious has become a symphony of consciousness that encompasses species barriers and offers humanity a glimpse of what we might become if we choose cooperation over competition, awareness over ignorance, and the expansion of consciousness over the limitations that have defined us throughout our evolutionary history. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.